Hi, my name is Suchith Tissera and I'll be discussing the motion. This House believes that multinational companies should be held liable for human rights abuses that occur anywhere in their supply chain. So basically, I'll be discussing this motion. Firstly, I'll be talking about proposition and giving like basic understanding of what the context on proposition is, the arguments on prop, and some basic ideas on responses that could be made and how exactly the debate is like to look like. And secondly, then I'm going to talk about opposition and then finish off the video talking about what the op arguments are and some ideas on ops were and how exactly op can win the debate. So firstly, then on proposition, I think the first thing to understand is the context in which this motion happens and who are the actors that carry out this process of suing. So basically it can be two types of actors. Firstly, it can be actors that are proximate to the human rights abuses. So these are, in the majority of cases, the human rights abuses in the supply chain is likely to happen from the manufacturing companies that are affiliated by these multinational companies. So basically they are like private contractors that the multinational companies are affiliated with. So they are likely to be in developing countries, especially in countries like Africa and in countries like within countries like Africa and in countries within Asia. So basically in instances like that, you have proximate actors within those countries that are likely to sue these multinational companies rather than suing the specific manufacturer that is committing these human rights abuses. But the second actor that can sue these multinational companies like to look like the individuals who are the consumers of this product in an instance that they believe that these the supply chain by which these particular multinational companies are providing these particular products are coming from like human rights abusing supply chains basically. So those are two actors, but the majority of this debate should focus on like the local actors who are very proximate to these human rights abuses. So then there's two key arguments that you can run on propositions world. The first argument on a more principle morality based argument, and secondly on a practical argument on why exactly having the ability to sue these multinational companies is like to have positive benefits. So the first argument then on like morality and why it's morally right to sue these multinational companies. And here I think it's very important to characterize the two types of contexts by which this argument can exist. So in the first context, these multinational companies have an understanding that, oh look, somewhere in our supply chain there's a manufacturer that commits human rights abuses. But the second instance is when they don't necessarily know human rights abuses are taking place. So either world, you need to prove on a moral basis why exactly it's why it's justified rather to sue these multinational companies. I think the easier thing to do is one in instances where they do know and they purposefully hide this information. So instances like this, where a multinational company knows that human rights abuses happen in the developing countries by which they're the manufacturers of those multinational companies, they have human rights abuses. In instances like that, you can prove that there's moral culpability because these multinational companies know that human rights abuses take place but don't go out and do anything or like notify or try to mitigate these harms from taking place. Much rather, you can push the burden that, oh look, at the point in which these multinational companies profit off of like products that are created based on human rights abuses, it's principally justified because they are culpable to those human rights abuses at the point in which they profit off of these products. So therefore, it's morally harmful at the point in which they do profit off of this, and because they allow these unjustified actions to take place. So I think you can push the idea on two lines there. So on a completely moral basis or more on a practical basis on like how exactly there's like a practically because of profit incentives they haven't actually gone out and done something. But the second thing to push is the idea, which is much harder, to say even in instances where these multinational companies don't know that these human rights abuses happen within their supply chain, why are they still culpable to the harms, and why is there still ability and right to sue these companies? I think again you can push the idea on profitability to say irrespective of whether or not they knew that these human rights abuses took place, by the virtue of the fact that the majority of the products and services provided by these companies come and are tainted from these human rights abuses, this means that the profit in and of itself again is tainted by these abuses. Therefore, it is justified then, irrespective of whether or not they knew about this, to go out and prosecute these individuals or sue these individuals much rather. But the second thing you can push is that they have a moral responsibility to know that these are happening. That is to say, basically saying that these multinational companies have a responsibility to know what's happening within their supply chain. So irrespective of whether or not they knew that these particular violations were happening, them not knowing those violations are happening is a foresight by them that can be prosecuted within the system and can be used as a ground to sue, because their foresight in not knowing that these abuses happening was a reason by which these abuses could happen, and therefore they have the ability to sue these individuals because it is a foresight by these multinational companies in and of itself. But the more powerful second push on proposition for a second argument is to push as to why exactly suing these corporations is likely to create a positive spillover effect which will have benefits to the multiplicity of stakeholders that this debate is discussing. So, firstly, you can discuss the current context by which this debate takes place. In the majority of cases, currently, a lot of multinational companies have the capacity to deflect the blame to the manufacturer and say that they have no idea that these particular violations and abuses were taking place, and they themselves have no responsibility when it comes to these violations. So they can just save themselves by holding no accountability to themselves. At the point in which now you have the capacity to go out and sue these multinational companies, it is at that point then that multinational companies now are going to be held more accountable. So the degree of accountability is much greater. So when the degree of accountability is much greater, this puts an added burden on these multinational companies to make sure that they are more incentivized to make sure that whoever they get into bed with within their supply chain in and of itself is likely to be individuals who have a positive track record and don't align themselves with human rights abuses. So basically the crux of this idea is to say why exactly multinational companies are more incentivized to make sure that they have a lot of checking mechanisms and transparency and background checks when it comes to the companies and manufacturers that they work with in the long run on propositions world. So at that point then, the impact on propositions world regarding this argument is basically why you have a more positive outlook of the manufacturers that they work with. But the second thing you can push, and this is more nuanced ideas, is to say exactly why multinational companies on props world are unlikely to work with and get into bed with very shady manufacturers or shady actors. So there is going to be more regulation at the point in which the self-regulation process is likely to happen, because if you do not self-regulate and make sure you don't get into bed with shady actors, you are likely to get a certain lawsuit which is likely to hurt your reputation to a greater degree, because you don't have the ability to deflect the blame that you would otherwise on opposition's world when you don't have this system in place. So I think the nuance here you could add is to say, to concede that you might have a reduction in the total amount of jobs created within developing countries by these multinational companies, but then push that you have far better quality of jobs and quality of workplaces, because the amount of transparency and checking mechanisms these multinational companies are likely to entail is going to be far greater. So even though you have a slight reduction in jobs, the quality of these jobs are going to be far more greater. I think the final thing to discuss here within opposition's world is a few responsive ideas you can bring up. So I think an easy push on opposition's world is to say how these multinational companies are likely to leave the countries in which they currently have manufacturing industries within. I think two responses are very ideal on props world. The first response is to look at it on a comparative basis to say, oh look, sure, it's going to be more expensive for multinational companies now to stay in developing nations compared to before, because now they have more checking mechanisms and more transparency policies that they need to follow. But compare that to the alternative, which is having to employ someone from a developed country who has a multiplicity of added baggage that comes with it, but also like want a higher salary. So even if the amount of money you pay now for a worker in a developing country is higher than before, it's likely to be significantly less than someone in a developed nation who is probably going to ask for a greater salary. So on a comparative basis, you can push the idea that even if multinational companies reduce the total employees within the developing nation, it's not going to completely forego some benefit that they get from a developing nation. I think the second push that proposition can make related to this idea is the idea that basically multinational companies already have infrastructure built within developing nations that they've built throughout the years. So even if you have this process where you can now sue multinational companies, that doesn't inherently mean that they can just opt out and leave these countries, because there's a lot of sunk cost that exists. And that means that the ability for them to just opt out and leave is so minimal. So this sunk cost then means that even if you can sue them, that it's far cheaper for them to just go out and create policies that make sure that there is a lot of transparency within these companies and manufacturing societies, compared to just going out and like working in a different country. So basically that is the argumentation on proposition. So moving on then to the argumentation that opposition can bring and the ideas on opposition. I think the first thing that opposition needs to do is question the ability of these individuals who sue these multinational companies, and whether on a practical level there's likely to create any tangible change. I think here you can just push the idea that comparatively, the individuals who are going to sue these people, multinational companies, are going to be far less powerful compared to a multinational company who has a great amount of pockets and a large amount of resources. So in a lot of instances, the ability to like go out and get any tangible change through the process of suing is like to be far less significant. So it's not going to get any tangible change on a practical level. So the largest amount of pushes you can bring on opposition are more practical pushes, why on a practical level suing these multinational companies or having a capacity to sue these multinational companies in instances of human rights abuses in their supply chain is likely to lead to practical benefits. So there's two key ideas you can bring on opposition. The first idea is on why it worsens exploitation. So the crux of this idea is to identify that human rights abuses happen on a spectrum. That yes, you concede that multinational companies let go and basically put a blind eye when it comes to human rights abuses that happen in certain instances. But they also make sure that the most gruesome and the most critical and the most morally unjustified human rights abuses don't happen through checking mechanisms, because they have a certain morality, but secondly they have a certain reputation to uphold. So here you concede that sure, certain human rights violations happen, and in some instances they do actually know about these violations happening. But then you argue that at the point in which multinational companies are likely to reduce the amount of manufacturing within a certain country, the certain countries in which these multinational companies initially existed will now fall into even greater turmoil. So basically the only reason why human rights abuses didn't happen to the most extreme degree was because multinational companies had an incentive to make sure that they draw a line somewhere where even if that line drawn was in a worse place than what is morally justified in most instances, at the point in which the control of a multinational company within this region in developing nations is let go, it is at that point that these regions are going to fall into even greater turmoil. So the characterization for this, for example, is sure, you can have minimum wages that are lower than what is universally justified as minimum wages, and the amount of hours that you work will be slightly higher than what is justified in a universal term. But those are likely to be the greatest amount of human rights abuses that exist at the point in which you have a multinational company controlling manufacturing. At the point in which you don't have the regulation bodies of these multinational companies, it is at that point then that the worst kind of abuses that are likely to happen is because you don't have a job for your children. You're going to sell your children out for things like human trafficking and other forms of extremely problematic and extremely derogatory human rights violations. So comparatively, even if you consider sure there's going to be a lot of human rights abuses that exist to marginal degrees on opposition's world, on proposition's world, at the point in which you start to sue these multinational companies and create a negative perception for them where they back off of these particular developing nations, it is at that point that developing nations are likely to fall into even more turmoil when it comes to these regions, because you can characterize that the regions in which these manufacturing firms exist do not have in-state regulations. So basically the police and government bodies of these developing countries don't have a lot of authority or the capacity to make sure, and they are in most instances very corrupt individuals, they don't have the capacity to make sure that regulation within these particular regions are likely to be great. So at that point, it is a multinational company's ability to then regulate this manufacturing and make sure that the greatest human rights violations don't happen. So on proposition's world then, when the multinational companies power and in some instances they don't even exist, it is at that point that the greatest human rights violations happen. So basically this argument entails you concede to a certain amount of harm and then prove why the harm is even greater on proposition's world at the point in which you back away from these particular countries as a multinational company. But the second push you can have on opposition is to talk about why exactly developing nations are going to be worst off. And here I think it's a direct clash with the idea of whether or not multinational companies are likely to leave these countries. So you can push the idea that in certain instances where there is going to be violations of human rights abuses, for a multinational company in the current society where there's a lot of backlash when it comes to things like social media and all of that, it is far cheaper, even if they have certain infrastructure created, for these companies to just opt out and leave, because there's other alternative countries that are likely to be very, very cheap as well. So even if they don't go to developed countries as the alternative, they can still go to other developing countries. Therefore, they forego a lot of the manufacturing institutions that exist in the initial developing country. And then you characterize the harm of this to that initial developing country by saying the reason as to why a lot of FDI and other benefits exist within these developing nations. So basically, they leave one African nation and go to an Asian nation, and what are the harms to that African nation is basically to say a lot of the benefits that come to this nation through a lot of investment is because of the existence of multinational companies that are very credible and are internationally recognized. And those likely entail more spotlight to those nations as well, and more tangible benefits as compared to investments, for example, as well. So all these things like investments are unlikely to be beneficial, unlikely to exist on proposition's world, because multinational companies are likely to opt and leave these countries in the first place. And then you can push the idea that even if they don't leave, in the vast majority of cases, the relationship that exists between the nations, the government body, and a multinational company is likely to be far more negative and far more problematic on proposition's world, because they don't have the same positive relationship, because now these government bodies are allowing individuals to sue these multinational companies. It is at that point then that additional benefits of multinational companies, so for example, pushing for more infrastructure within those countries and pushing for more investment within these countries and helping their people, is likely to reduce. So even if the initial infrastructure and the initial manufacturing doesn't completely opt out and leave, additional manufacturing and infrastructure procedures within those developing countries is likely to be disbarred. So that's basically the argumentation on opposition related to why exactly it's going to be bad for developing nations. A final thing that opposition can run on moral basis is to try to prove as to why the majority of this debate is likely to be about instances in which these multinational companies are unlikely to know the human rights violations and the degree of these human rights violations. So you can prove the idea that basically multinational companies majority come from Western nations where on a cultural level things like human rights abuses are culturally frowned upon, and secondly because of like the large amount of backlash that exists and a lot of reputational harm that exists, these multinational companies have an incentive to make sure that there's checking mechanisms within these countries. So I think something that's important here to characterize using this, and which helps the initial ideas I brought up on opposition as well, it reduces the capacity in which these human rights abuses take place. So even if you concede human rights abuses happen, the capacity of human rights abuses using this idea means that the amount of human rights abuses that happen are likely to be not as significant as the human rights abuses that may happen at the point in which you don't have a multinational company controlling certain infrastructure and certain manufacturing and overlooking certain manufacturing. So then you can prove the idea that why exactly are they not culpable in that instance, because you can basically try to prove that they are, and this is more responsive ideas, is basically saying they aren't responsible because they aren't the ones who are directly committing these particular human rights abuses, because it is in most instances in manufacturing companies and rather like manufacturing institutions that have nothing to do with these particular multinational companies. They are a separate entity entirely that just have a third party contract with a multinational company. So these multinational companies can't go to the intricacies of these particular manufacturing corporations, rather they can just go out and sign contracts with them. So they should not be held liable because the human rights abuses take place by a third party that they are not directly part of. So in that instance then they should not be able to be sued because these human rights violations don't happen by these multinational companies and much rather third party. So those are the ideas you can bring out from opposition as well, and this basically proves on opposition why exactly exploitation is likely to be greater on a proposition's world, and secondly on a practical basis on why the developing nations are likely to be worse, and you can have a push on why on a moral level you're likely to not why you're not morally culpable. I think as the debate would progress, proposition has a stronger morality push on why on a moral level these multinational corporations have should be held culpable, but secondly on opposition they have a more stronger push on a practical level on what exactly the outcome of this motion's existence is likely to be to developing nations, and whether it's going to have a positive impact. So that's basically the ideas on why on this motion related to multinational companies and their supply chains.